This week, when I had the chance to be liturgist today, I had the idea that it might be fun to read Ancient Witness, actually from the book. So I want to thank Julie Tarlin, our administrative assistant, for excavating this giant Bible for us today. So we're reading today from Matthew chapter 14, verses 13 to 21. Now when Jesus heard this, he withdrew from there in a boat to a deserted place by himself. But when the crowds heard it, they followed him on foot from the towns. When he went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion for them and cured their sick. When it was evening, the disciples came to him and said, "This is a deserted place, and the hour is now late. Send the crowds away so that we may go into the villages and buy food for themselves." Jesus said to them, "They need not go away. You give them something to eat." They replied, "We have nothing here but 5 loaves and 2 fish." And he said, "Bring them here to me." Then he ordered the crowds to sit down on the grass. Taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven and blessed and broke the loaves and gave them to the disciples. And the disciples gave them to the crowds. And all ate and were filled. And they took up what was left over of the broken pieces, 12 baskets full. And those who ate were about 5,000 men, besides the women and children. Amen.
Of all the miracle stories told in the Gospels, the story of the sharing of the loaves and the fishes is told a total of 6 times. Twice in Matthew, kind of edited to sound like 2 different events, we don't know. Twice in Mark, once in Luke, and once in John. And that's interesting because it tells us something, mainly that the lessons of this story are significant. They're foundational in many ways. There is something to pay attention here. There is something central to the core message of the gospel, just by the fact that it's told so consistently in all 4 gospels. The message of provision, plenty, enough, and sharing. These ideas, we might call them spiritual laws of the universe, are all wrapped up in these various iterations told in these gospel stories. I imagine if we all took a moment and tried to remember what some of the childhood rules we grew up being taught by our families, either implied or explicit, we could come up with a few. And as I was thinking about this gospel lesson, I remember one of the rules my mom insisted on when I was very young, and it is super rude to eat in front of your friends unless you are willing to share what you have. No eating the afternoon snack in the presence of your friends unless you're planning on sharing with them equally. My mom certainly, I don't think, was thinking of the story of the loaves and the fishes, but essentially this rule captures the basic principle of sharing, an ethic that became a part of my early childhood memories. Sharing, and specifically the sharing of basic life-sustaining elements like food, is the foundation of functioning social structures. I'm not an archaeologist or an anthropologist, but in my understanding, in tribal society, the principles of sharing were essential for everyone's survival. It was fundamental. Everyone depended upon everyone else within the small group of the tribe. Things were shared in common. Everyone's welfare was looked after. And over a few short millennia, we humans have moved from small tribal groups of 30, 40 people to larger city-states. You could say we're tribes of sorts, and then to even larger nation-states, larger tribes. And here we are in 2023, and we find ourselves, it seems to me, stumbling toward a new global human chapter, but we don't know exactly what it is. The nation-state system seems to be breaking down or not functioning well on the long term. So where are we humans going with this thing? What are we going to do? We are faced with this, like it or not. We are in globally and ecologically interconnected and interdependent sort of human system now. One tribe, all 8 billion of us, and not unlike the disciples of Jesus. We might, 2,000, we are disciples of Jesus, but the disciples of 2,000 years ago, we might ask, who will feed them? None of us know where these modern challenges are taking us, but one thing is for certain: if we human species don't learn to live by the basic principles of enough and of sharing, life may not be possible, and it certainly won't be pleasant, currently isn't pleasant for many who are struggling deeply. But the gospel charts a different story. The gospel charts a story of a world that thrives, a world that moves toward the Hebrew idea of shalom, well-being, peace, wholeness, provision. These are key principles in our biblical theology. In our story this morning, the basic problem of hunger is presented to Jesus. Rabbi, send them away so they can go into the villages and get something to eat. It may not have been practical, but, Jesus could have done that. Or he could have just done the miracle himself. You know how it's sometimes easier to do a job yourself than to delegate. But that would have missed the point. In fact, as I think about it, for Jesus to have provided the food or the miracle through his own action for this mass feeding, it would have been, in many ways, as I thought about it, to succumb to one of the 3 original temptations Jesus resisted while fasting in the wilderness when he was tempted by Satan. To turn stones into bread and thus have the world eating out of the palm of your hand, so to speak. But were Jesus to have done that, it would have totally missed the teaching of this so-called miracle. So instead, Jesus says to his disciples, you go give them something to eat. Now, how crazy is that, right? If you were in that situation, it'd be absurd. Place yourself in that position. We live in a limited world of scarcity. And yet, this is the basic element of the story. You give them something to eat. These very words, by the way, are inscribed on the side of the Bread for the World building in Washington, D.C. Bread for the World, as many of us know, has been around for a while. It's an organization whose mission is to make the gospel story of the fishes, the sharing of the bread, fishes, and loaves manifest to the world and end world hunger. It is possible. They have the audacity to have an organization that thinks such a thing is possible, because it is. So instead, Jesus says, give them something to eat. And then what does Jesus say after that? After they gather some of these small group of small quantity of bread and fish, he gives thanks. In other words, gratitude, not taking things for granted. It seems to me that gratitude is a key frame of mind for the cultivation of a giving heart. because we know when we feel gratitude, we are more inclined to share. So why gratitude? Because the truth of the matter is, we didn't make any of this stuff. None of it. It's all a gift. On top of that, it's all provisional. It's on loan, if you will. And the older we get, the more that profound truth starts to sink in. It does for me anyway. I mistakenly used to think that I own a piece of land and I own a house that sits on that land. But ownership really isn't much more than an illusion when you start to think about it. I'm actually just renting everything for a while. And that's all any of us are doing. Rich or poor, it's all provisional. So then what happens in the story? The food is distributed to everyone, all are fed, no one goes hungry, and there is even leftovers. Someone once said that faith is acting despite the evidence to the contrary, and then watching the evidence change. That seems to be what is happening in this story. Acting despite the apparent limitations. This story, if you will recall, reflects our biblical story lesson. In other words, there is a common theme here. There's a common theme that runs throughout certain biblical stories. You can recall the Israelites wandering in the wilderness and daily manna and quail being miraculously provided. That's a biblical theme reflected of the loaves and fishes story. Or we can recall the story of Elijah told in 1 Kings 17, where a famine comes across the land. Elijah meets a widow and her son who are preparing to eat the very last of their food, a little bit of flour and oil, and then simply give up and die. But in the act of the widow sharing what she had with the great prophet, the miracle of provision gets them through. Or there's the apocryphal story of in the book of Maccabees of the lamp in the temple that only had 1 day's supply of oil but lasts for 8 days. That's the celebration of Hanukkah. Or even the story of Jesus turning water into wine as the supply runs low at the wedding feast. All these stories remind us that within our earthly situation, whereby human vulnerability comes up against perceived scarcity, hunger and lack do not need to get the last word, or it doesn't have to. One of the things that is interesting about the story from Matthew 14 is that it is preceded by the story of the execution of John the Baptist. If you recall that story, King Herod, the puppet ruler of Judea, is having a party. And during the party, his stepdaughter performs a wonderful dance for him, and he is so enchanted by her that he offers to pledge her up to half his kingdom. At the bidding of her mother, she asks for the head of John the Baptist, who up at this point has been imprisoned for speaking truth to power, and Herod reluctantly complies. This story offers for us, the readers of the Gospels we have today, it offers an interesting contrast. On one hand, you have the violent, corrupt, fearful world of King Herod, living isolated in a palace. On the other hand is Jesus in the open countryside, speaking with common folks who need healing, words of hope, and basic human needs like having food. Herod lives in a world of perceived scarcity. Jesus operates out of the mindset of abundance. Herod lives in a world where the strong prey upon the weak. And Jesus lives in a world where the meek are the ones whose inheritance is the earth. Herod lives in a small, limited world of isolation and loneliness. Jesus gathers a community based on sharing and enough to go around. So the question is, for us, which world do we believe in? Herod's world or Jesus' world? Which world do we want to live in? If we're honest, we're conflicted. We're not conflicted by our desires. We want people to do well. We want all to do well. We long for a world where all receive what they need. But we also are painfully aware that, comparatively speaking, we have great wealth and the comfort it affords in comparison to the millions who live on the margins. If we're uncomfortable with that reality, that's a good thing. We still have our humanity intact. But still, the question remains. We don't want to sit there with the guilt or bad feelings. We want to do something. So what do we do? What do we have to give up? What will it cost us to imagine ourselves amongst those first followers of Jesus when he told them, you give them something to eat? Well, one thing we have to do, I think, is fight against the current national trends of fear and notions of not enough. Turn away those fleeing poverty and persecution at the border and close it down. We don't have enough. Cut programs that help lift people out of poverty. We don't have enough. Cut subsidies like SNAP. We don't have enough. Ignore the growing injustices of wealth disparity, and then treat homelessness and addiction as the problem rather than a symptom of a much deeper problem of a broken economic system, and more importantly, of spiritual decay. We don't have enough. Really? Is that really true? I don't think we believe it. We shouldn't. But the gospel lesson this morning tells us that that is a lie. If there is anything to take away from the loaves and fishes story this morning, it is this: there is enough. As Gandhi once said, there is enough in the world for all our needs, just not enough for all our greeds. So what do we do? How about we start with cultivating our mindset? Jesus, I believe, teaches us to live out of a new spiritual paradigm, a new way of thinking about ourselves and about the world and about what is possible, because ultimately the problems we face are spiritual before they are economic. So I want to suggest 4 things that might help in our framing of this. We need to understand that we operate out of privilege. When we get up in the morning or when we go about our day, that privilege should tell us, I get to, not I have to. I get to share out of my abundance, not I have to. I get to be a vessel of God's love through my giving of time and talents and resources, not I have to. And if you do that, you will notice, at least I do, notice a shift in the whole inner world when I remember that I get to, not that I have to. Another thing I might suggest for shifting this paradigm in our own inner world is to make gratitude our foundation. We live in gratitude for everything we have, and I put have in quotes. The word have, like I say, is somewhat of an illusion, right? Everything gets left behind. The only thing that remains after we're gone is our kindness, generosity, and our wisdom that is felt and remembered by those we leave behind. Another thing we might consider in shifting our paradigm, our mindset, is no, we are not an isolated part. You are not isolated. I am not isolated. We are all interconnected. My well-being is tied to yours. My thriving is tied to yours. My children's future is tied to your children's future. This is the reality. It's not even an ideal. It is the reality that we have to face. And one other thing I might suggest is celebrate that you are God's great mystery. We are all a part of an eternal inheritance. Our perceived world is much, much, much grander, mysterious, and inclusive than we can ever know. And you are a part of that, and you will never cease to be a part of that. I believe the Bible calls us to imagine what is possible on earth as it is in heaven. As I end this meditation on the subject of abundance and enough, I decided I think I want to quote or end with the reading, I suppose, of the prophet Isaiah, whose words reflect to me a calling for a better world where all are satisfied and no one goes away hungry. Kind of a new paradigm that Isaiah was framing. It says, "Come, all you who are thirsty. Come to the waters. You who have no money, come, buy, eat. Come, buy wine and milk without money and without cost. Why spend your money on what is not bread, or your labor on what does not satisfy? Listen to me and eat what is good. As the rain and the snow come down from heaven and do not return to it without watering the earth and making it bud and flourish so that it yields seed for the sower and bread for the eater, so my word that comes out of my mouth, it will not return to me empty, but will accomplish what I desire and achieve the purpose for which I sent it." We get to be a part of that to the degree we will allow it to happen through our lives. May God bless the reading of the word this morning.